Welcome, Gemini, to your year 2026 deep dive horoscope forecast. I'm going to share with you some standout themes for the year to begin with. Then on screen, I'll share your solar return right at the start of the year, always influential, provides a backdrop for the following 12 months. But we do need to be mindful of the eclipse series that takes us into year 2026, the eclipses that are coming. We need to be mindful of the role of your ruler Mercury, which is going to go through 3 watery retrogrades over the year. And also we need to be conscious of the big hitters, not least Saturn returning back to the sign of Aries in mid-February. Neptune returns there at the end of January, but critically you have Uranus, the planet of surprises, re-entering your sign after its initial 5-month sojourn last year at the end of April, where it's going to be for the following 7 years. We're also going to have Jupiter, the planet of fortune, relocating at the end of June. What's the significance of that? And that new eclipse series does begin in your sister air sign of Aquarius. What's the significance? Because I feel that's going to have quite the impact over the first 6 months of this year. And then as we go into the end of July, the North Node, the point of destiny, inverts back into the sign of Aquarius for the first time in 18.7 years. So that's a really big deal. We come into the end of the year with the final eclipse in the series between Pisces and Virgo on the 28th of August. But also we need to be mindful of the 4 cardinal quadrants, which begins with the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumnal equinox, and the winter solstice, which brings the curtain down on the year. But most of all, Gemini, I'd like to be mindful of your ruler Mercury. I think that's very important. And I can tell you, for the 3rd year running, Mercury starts the year in your sector of relationships, but in a sign where Mercury is in its detriment, Sagittarius. But the key is that as we come into the year, Mercury is in a very challenging right angle with the dreamy drifting energies of Neptune, but also with the strict Saturn, both right at the top of your chart in the part of your situation to do with your worldly interface. Whether it is through your professional situation, your goals and ambitions, your public standing, your desires to raise your profile, any ambitions you've got, communication, your gift, is going to be very important when it is connected to the people you need to reach out to, but also collaborate with. So success this year is likely to be very dependent on the clarity of your message. Now, I mentioned also about the Mercury retrogrades. There's 3, each in a water sign. We have the first one, which begins on February the 26th, and that goes through to March the 20th in Pisces. So once more, that part of your situation to do with your worldly interactions. We then have, that's for 22 days, we then have one at the end of June in the part of your situation to do with your everyday finances. And then that's for 24 days. The final one is in a part of your chart to do with life's structure, everyday routines. The 6th house can be to do with appointments, and that's from October the 24th to November the 13th. But the significance is, although the host, Pisces, Cancer and Scorpio, are very watery and therefore about emotion, in terms of the house for you, it's very earthly. The 10th house for Pisces, the 2nd house for Cancer, and the 6th house, very Virgo-like, for that Scorpio Mercury retrograde. So how you handle your resources, how you connect to the wider world, but also how you separate the emotion from the logic. Remember, logic is your gift, but I feel that emotion could crowd your decision making this year, and that's going to be one of your challenges, because as we come into this new year, the 2 eclipses of September 2025 are still working in a coordinated way. The first of those on the 7th of September did occur in the sign of Pisces. So that's very much about how you feel about where you work, who you work with, and perhaps any leadership role you have outside of work, perhaps even within the family. And then the second one on the 21st of September was late in the sign of Virgo and was in an opposition with the strict Saturn. So that's a classic work-life balance issue. So as you come into this new year, your communications with people professionally, but also getting that right balance point between the available time you have for your family, your children, keeping the domestic hub working well, but also linking out and making a success of yourself. That could be part of the challenge early in 2026. But what about the opportunities? Well, if you remember, Jupiter, the planet of fortune, did enter your sector of everyday money last year, but was instantly conflicted exactly on June the 15th by the strict Saturn. So you may not have found last year that you did get the rewards you quite wanted. Well, the good news in the first 6 months of this year, you can punch through, but it will require a lot of grit, determination and application. One of the things that defines you is your mercurial energy. So you have an ability to flow, to flex, to pivot, and obviously respond to situations using your mind in a very skillful way. But I feel it will be key to understand that your utterances, your pledges, whatever you say you can do, will be scrutinized carefully this year because the year starts with Saturn in the 10th house. But Saturn's going to make its way back to join up with Neptune, which moves at the end of January, into your 11th house. And over the next couple of years, that's going to see you redefining some of your long-term hopes and plans. That could also see a watching brief around certain friends and associations. There could be some change in the mix, to be honest. Now, Saturn will go retrograde at the end of July through till the 10th of December, and it is going to invert around about 7 degrees. So if you do find during that retrograde in particular that some of those long-term hopes do slow down a little bit, it wouldn't be a complete surprise. But do know that Jupiter is moving at the end of June into a part of your chart which actually is going to help you to use your core skills as a quick communicator in a very flamboyant way. Going through the sign of Leo, the retrograde that applies to Jupiter each year is 4 months, but it's not going to happen this year until December the 13th, and it will make its way all the way out to 27 degrees. So if you do have planets later in the sign of Gemini, or obviously elsewhere in your chart in fire or air positions, that can provide a lot of uplift for your message. So as much as you start this year being encouraged to be conscious of who you need to work with, essentially the 10th house is where we might at times need to understand that who we're connecting to has a more conventional or more orthodox mindset or approach. And if we are someone who's more of a free spirit, and often Gemini people are very quick thinkers, so it is a maverick influence, Gemini, your ruler Mercury in some ways, that speed of thought doesn't always mesh well if it is a more stodgy institution. So if you do work in a big business or a governmental institution, that could be where you feel the pinch point. But if you're more entrepreneurial and you want to break through on your own terms and do your own thing, I feel that the second half of this year could be incredibly exciting for you. But it could also see you changing some plans that in the past seem to be very much set in stone. Although you can be very flexible at the best of times, there could be a big reorientation that does come as Saturn dives deeper into that 11th house. And as I mentioned, there could be different friends coming in, particularly in the second half of the year. Now, I'm going to share with you now the event chart for the start of the year. But just before I go into that, I want to share with you about my unique offer. You can order your personal natal forecast for year 2026 now, and I'll give you the rest of this year free. But also you'll get 30% off the individual prices, and you'll get your life roadmap report in my special package. That really helps you to understand the patterns that have played out in your life so far. All of us, it's totally unique to each person, but understanding those patterns and matching them to the forecast will help you to make your moves in the new year much more shrewdly. But also in my special offer, you'll get your free general zodiac forecast for each of the 12 signs, but also your Chinese forecast, your Vedic forecast, and your love forecast too in my special booklets. Please see the link below for more. The moon in your sign. I'm going to pivot back for the rest of the year in terms of the eclipses once I've shared this with you. But you can see the moon's in your sign. The moon in the first house wants us to embrace our identity, our emotional identity. But the moon's very much about feelings, and Gemini people can obviously feel things, but sometimes in a more cerebral way. You process emotion through your thoughts and can be quite rational. So what that moon position there is just reminding you to stay in touch with the more sensory part of your nature. But she is forging a stunning link to Pluto there in the 9th house. So if you are connecting to people who help you to expand, who understand your vision, your philosophies and your message, and if you're involved in any kind of technology or publishing, that's a very strong alliance. What's not to like? But the other curious thing about your solar return is not just you can see Mercury there in your 7th house of relating, as I mentioned, and the square to Saturn and Neptune, but look at those two icons next to Saturn. That's the moon and the sun. That's the midpoint between the position of the moon in Gemini and the sun in Capricorn, as it always is at the start of the year. And that midpoint is, if you like, the yin yang of all of our years, and that's very close to Saturn. So Pisces energy encourages us to embrace what's not necessarily so tangibly obvious. Not so easy for an air sign. Saturn and Neptune side by side, but clashing back with your ruler Mercury. So that's where the challenge could come if you do need to deal with people who don't quite understand the message that you're conveying. But what are the opportunities of the year? Well, I feel it does come from the cluster of energy in the sign of Capricorn. Here we have the Sun at 10 degrees 34, just in the second decan of Capricorn, as always, subruled by Venus, can be about money, but relationships, but very close to the relator Venus. Now, in traditional astrology, they may say that the Sun and Venus are combust, and therefore the Sun overpowers the energy of Venus. But we have Mars in the mix as well, and Mars loves being in Capricorn. It's exalted. And Mars here, along with Venus in the 8th house, tells me if you're wanting a significant relationship this year, but particularly of a romantic kind where it's much more intimate, you could have a lot of desire to actually make that happen. But also the 8th house can be about shared finances, resources, investments, long-term planning. And if you are that more entrepreneurial person, I feel that there could be some real fortune that comes your way. Certainly your drive and your passion can be very strong. But the intriguing thing is, being an air sign and being Gemini, where you like to be just freely available and not too fixed, those energies are pushing you in a way to be open to a much more devotional connection, whether it is through a professional situation or it is in a relationship. Now, if you are in a long-term relationship as this year begins, and you feel that maybe in terms of the power dynamic between you and your partner, there isn't quite a simpatico between you. In other words, one of you wants to dominate the tie. There is the potential with that 8th house energy in Capricorn that something could come to a close, being really honest. Or a relationship could be invigorated in a much more romantic, sensual and sexual way with those combination of players. But it needs to be right in all the different elements of the relationship. And the other thing to point out is that whilst Mercury does square with that midpoint, Sun Moon midpoint, the yin yang of the chart, Saturn and Neptune, which is really challenging, and I feel could definitely see some very tense exchanges. You could even encounter someone who's rather unethical, and just be conscious that Uranus, although is going to be joining your sign towards the end of April after that original 5-month visit last year, that's also in a quincunx with Mercury. So if you're in an ongoing relationship and you feel that there's some unspoken tension, some kind of blockage, I feel some of those could come up into the open, because the 8th house energy, particularly with Mars and Venus being together, in a way it can be somewhat confrontational. It doesn't mean to say that there's going to be arguments as such, but there will be a desire on your part to in some way transform your situation. And so if you're not feeling a connection with someone, if their energy is not chiming with you in the way you really deserve, you may push and try to get them to open up to reveal what the issue may be. So all sorts of relationships this year are definitely going to take some care. But I want to just draw your attention to that solar eclipse in Aquarius on the 17th of February, because that is going to be very late in Aquarius, and therefore it's going to be in a very tense right angle with Uranus, and that's in your 12th house. And with the solar eclipse in your 9th house, the potential for something to be pushed into the open that perhaps is rather sensitive, confidential, not something you necessarily want to be revealed, is very strong. So if there's something that's working away in the subterranean part of your life, whether it's in your psyche, in terms of your relationships, if there's some secretiveness or something isn't working in a very open and ventilated way, the chances are it will come into the open in the first half of 2026. But the second half of the year, once we have the solar eclipse in the sign that the sun rules of Leo, fantastic, the first time for 19 years on the 12th of August, that provides a backdrop whilst Jupiter's in the sign. So that's a double positive for the next 6 months, which can see communications flow so much better. But we do have the final lunar eclipse in the sign of Pisces on the 28th of August, and that brings to a close that eclipse series, which has seen you grappling with that work-life balance issue. And I feel by then you probably will have tied things down. But look forwards to a very exciting second half of the year. But of course, relating is ruled by Venus. And we do have a Venus retrograde, which does begin on October the 3rd. Initially, it's going to be in the very practical 6th house. So who does and contributes what in terms of the domestic sphere around a living relationship could be something that needs to be thought about. But it inverts back into the air sign of Libra on November the 14th. And weirdly, that could potentially reconnect you to someone from your past, or see you thinking very carefully about what you want from a current relationship. But I think the key for this year for you, Gemini, is very much dialogue. And the clearer your dialogue can be, and the more heartfelt it can be, the better. So there's that part of you that can be so smart and can be very artful, you know, almost like the magician. Your ability to be a bit of a wizard with words and move the moment, I feel could get scrutinized this year, but particularly in the first half of the year. The second half of the year gives you an opportunity to set some new longer term aims and goals. The pace of life will pick up, and I think you're in for a very, very exciting second 6 months of 2026. But care with communication, with 3 retrogrades in water signs, asking you to think about life's earthy principles of everyday money, work and practicalities, but also the year beginning with your ruler in detriment, clashing with Saturn, the midpoint, and Neptune, suggests that how people see you is very important this year. Your perception needs to be shaped, and being conscious of how people view you, as much as how you may want to express what's important to you, is going to be part of the opportunity to shape things in a more satisfactory way. So I think the first 6 months really does require some care. The second 6 months can see you really starting to speed up and absolutely charming people. And if you are looking for a new relationship, I feel it could be one that is very, very important to you. Have a great year 2026. Please visit patrickarundell.com